They say every person has their own secret doorway to hell. For 45-year-old James Caulfield, owner of the prestigious Alpha Legion Fight Club and former Marine Recon, that door had been creaking open for the past few months. He didn't know yet about his wife's infidelity, but his animal instincts, honed through years of special ops, were already picking up on the subtle shifts in their lives. Sarah, his 38-year-old spouse and a well-known sports psychologist, was increasingly staying late at work with a new patient, rising MMA star Ryan Kelly, whose story hit too close to home for her, echoing the tragedy of her own brother. 5 a.m. at Alpha Legion always began the same way. James went up to his office, pulled out his worn leather journal, and made another entry, a habit left over from his service days. It was only here, in these lines, that he allowed himself to be real, shedding the mask of the impenetrable owner of an elite fight club. Sarah's drifting further away, he scrawled in a firm hand. Alas, some battles can't be won with a knockout. Closing the journal, he went down to the gym. The space pulsed with the rhythmic thud of punching bags and the ragged breathing of fighters. James stopped at the edge of the octagon, arms crossed. His presence was almost palpable, like a gravitational field that made everyone push harder. "Keep your elbows tighter to your body, Mike." His voice, like a whip, cut through the humid air of the gym. "Leave a hole in your guard like that, and you'll be lights out in the first minute." Watching the young fighters sparring, he absently rubbed the scar on his left wrist. The sounds of the gym suddenly faded, and an image from 10 years ago flashed before his eyes. A dusty Afghan village, the smell of gunpowder, and the screams of his men. An ambush, blood on the sand, the crackle of automatic weapons fire. He still remembered the faces of every single man he'd lost that day. James was the only survivor of that meat grinder, and sometimes at night the question still haunted him. Why him? "Boss!" A young trainer's voice pulled him from the memory. "New guys here to sign up. Says he's ex-Marine." James nodded, but his gaze was already fixed on something across the gym. Through the glass partition, he saw his wife, Sarah, walk into her office. Following her was a tall, athletic young man. It had to be Ryan Kelly, the rising star she talked about at dinner. Young, handsome. Something in their movements, the way they stood close to each other, set off his internal radar, the same one that had saved his life in the war. In her office, decorated in calming beige tones, Sarah prepared for her first official consultation with Ryan. She arranged her little collection of porcelain elephants, a good luck charm she'd started after her brother's death. Ryan sat across from her, nervously tapping his fingers on the armrest of the chair. His recent panic attack before a major fight had been a nasty surprise for everyone, but it was something that needed to stay quiet. "Tell me about your father's death in the ring, Ryan," Sarah said softly, noting how his shoulders tensed at those words. She saw that under stress, he developed a slight stutter, a detail she automatically added to her professional notes. I barely remember his face," Ryan said hoarsely. "Just him lying there in the ring. I was 12. You know what's the worst? I was mad at him that day. He'd promised to go to the ballgame with me, but then they offered him this no-rules fight with good money. He wanted to buy us box seats." Something inside Sarah's chest ached. It was such a familiar story, just like her brother, who hadn't survived the injury that had ended his athletic career. Her professional eye noted Ryan unconsciously clenching and unclenching his fists, a sure sign of suppressed emotion. "And your mother? How did she handle that?" Sarah asked, although she already knew the answer from his file. Ryan stood up and went to the window, his broad shoulders stiffening. "She still can't watch my fights. Says I betrayed my father's memory by choosing what killed him." Later that day, the Caulfields' kitchen was flooded with warm light, but the atmosphere was far from cozy. James methodically chopped vegetables for a salad, a habit of order ingrained from years of service. Sarah was talking about her new patient, and her voice was too animated, her eyes shining a little brighter than usual. "He's an incredibly strong person," she said, stirring the sauce. "Can you imagine? After her father died, his mother was completely against boxing, but he still found a way to train." The knife in James's hand paused for a second. Something in his wife's voice. He looked at her more closely. New blouse, more careful makeup. "When did this start? A week ago? A month?" Was all he replied, putting the vegetables into a bowl. "How's your other client? The one with the Olympic team?" Sarah stumbled mid-sentence like she'd just remembered other patients existed. "Oh, everything's on track," she said, turning to the stove, avoiding his gaze. "It's just that working with Ryan, with Mr. Kelly, takes up a lot of time right now." Dinner passed in the usual silence. They'd long forgotten how to talk about anything personal, hiding behind discussions of work and daily routines. James remembered when it had started, after the doctors said he would never be able to have children because of a military injury. Sarah had said then that it didn't matter, but something had snapped in their relationship. The next few weeks flew by like a blur. Sarah was staying late at work more and more. "A difficult case," she would explain. James would nod silently, throwing himself into the organization of a new tournament. But his military training never slept. He noticed every detail. The new perfume, the more careful makeup, slightly more revealing outfits for work. He saw how her stride changed when she left for another therapy session, how her eyes lit up when she spoke about her patient's progress. And in Sarah's office, meanwhile, something was happening that shouldn't have been. With each session, the walls of professionalism grew thinner. She caught herself admiring his movements when he nervously paced the office. Her heart would start to beat faster when he smiled his rare, boyish smile. "You know," he said one day, looking out the window, "when I'm in the ring, I feel like my father's watching me. I can't let him down. Can't show any weakness." At that moment, Sarah realized she'd completely lost her professional distance. She saw in him not just a patient. She saw a reflection of her brother, the one she hadn't been able to save. But there was something else, something far more dangerous. And James was just waiting, like they'd taught him in recon: observe, analyze, plan, and prepare for the worst. In the evenings, he'd stand for a long time at the panoramic window in his club office, looking out at the city lights. The new tournament was already starting to take shape in his mind. Something special, something personal. After all, everyone has their secret doorway to hell, and sometimes we invite others in. James knew this better than most. He'd seen his hell in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan. And now it seemed it was time to show it to others. The envelope lay on James's desk like a small time bomb. Just an ordinary white envelope with no signature and no return address, discreetly slipped into his personal mail. Inside, a few glossy photos. Sarah and Ryan at a cafe across the street from the club. Her hand on his shoulder at the entrance to a park. Their silhouettes in the window of her office late at night. James looked at the photos with the same cold calm with which he'd once studied intelligence reports before a mission. Thought it would hurt more, he wrote in his journal, methodically forming each letter. His military habit of order didn't fail him, even now. He looked at his watch, 4:30 a.m. In half an hour, the usual training session would begin at the club, and no one should notice that his world had just crumbled. That same morning, on the other side of the city, Joe Ramirez, his old friend from the military hospital, now a leading neurosurgeon, was reviewing medical scans in his office. His massive frame hunched over the desk as his fingers quickly flipped through a patient's file. "You sure you want to know this, Jim?" Joe looked up at his friend. "Doctor-patient confidentiality." "Absolutely, brother," James interrupted him. Ramirez sighed heavily and turned the monitor. Look, spinal injury, C5, C6. There's nerve compression already. A couple more hard hits at the right angle and the guy could end up paralyzed. He should have stopped professional fights 6 months ago. James looked at the scans with a detached interest. Like pieces of a puzzle, the events of the last few weeks were coming together into a clear picture. That was why Ryan always winced at certain movements. And in Sarah's office, meanwhile, her own drama was unfolding. Ryan sat slumped in his chair, his usually confident posture giving away fatigue and pain. Mom's really bad. His voice sounded hollow. Cancer. Doctors say there's a clinic in Switzerland, but it's crazy expensive. Sarah caught herself reaching out to his shoulder. The touch lasted a second longer than professional guidelines would allow. Ryan, you can't carry this burden alone. She tried to sound firm, but her voice cracked. He looked up at her, and there was such vulnerable gratitude in his eyes that it took Sarah's breath away. God, what am I doing? She thought, but it was too late. Later that same day, James gathered a press conference. Cameras flashed like lightning as he announced the new Warriors Legacy Tournament. $2 million in prize money. An unprecedented format. The best fighters in the country. This isn't just going to be a tournament. His voice was confident and calm. It's going to be a test of character. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ryan in the front row lean forward when he heard the amount of the prize money. Next to him sat Sarah, her face pale. She knew that tone of her husband's. That's how he sounded when making big decisions. The next few weeks turned into a whirlwind of events. Ryan trained like a man possessed, despite his increasing bouts of pain. Each morning he started by kissing his old father's gloves, a ritual he never skipped. You shouldn't be doing this, Sarah pleaded with him after another training session, seeing how he was struggling to turn his head. I have to. His jaw was clenched. I'm gonna win and get the prize money for my mom's treatment. For my mom. For my dad. For myself. In his obsession, she increasingly saw chilling parallels to her brother. The same willingness to go all the way, the same contempt for pain and danger. This realization terrified her. And James was watching all this with the cold, calculating mindset of a chess player. Every evening he'd stay late in his office, setting up the fight brackets. He knew who Ryan had to fight and when to make sure his injury reached the critical point just in time for the final. The climax came on Friday evening. Sarah was staying late at the club, going through paperwork. When she came out of her office, James was waiting for her in the hallway, leaning against the wall. How's the work going with Mr. Kelly? He asked with a deceptively light tone. Sarah froze. Something in his voice made her go cold. Everything's on track. She tried to sound even, but her hands trembled. Really? James slowly pulled out the envelope with the photos from his pocket. Because it seems to me that everything went a bit too far from the original plan. Sarah looked at the photos, and the ground seemed to fall from under her feet. All their meetings, all the touches, all the glances, now it looked so obvious. James, she began, but he raised a hand, stopping her. Don't. His voice was quiet, but each word hit like a whip. Just tell me one thing. Do you know about his injury? Sarah went even paler. What injury? And at that moment, James realized two things. First, his wife was truly in love with another man. Second, she had no idea she was pushing him toward possible death in the ring. Your patient is hiding a serious spinal injury, he said evenly. A couple more hard hits, and he could end up paralyzed. Or worse. Sarah put a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. And James continued, clearly and methodically. And you know what's the most interesting thing? He's gonna get in that ring anyway. Because he needs the money for his mother's treatment. because he's obsessed with proving something to his dead father. And because the wrong person was there to stop him. The Alpha Legion arena hummed like a disturbed beehive. The first day of the Warriors Legacy Tournament had drawn full stands. News of the record prize fund had spread throughout the country. James stood backstage, watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the curtain. His face, usually impenetrable, showed a hint of satisfaction today. The first part of the plan was going perfectly. Ryan was preparing for his first fight in the locker room. His hands were shaking slightly as he took out his father's gloves from his bag. Worn, seen better days, but carefully kept all these years. After kissing them as usual, he winced from a sharp pain in his neck. "You need to withdraw from the tournament." Sarah's voice trembled. She was standing in the doorway, pale and worn out after yesterday's conversation with her husband. "Ryan, this injury, don't start." He cut her off. "I'm fine," but they both knew it was a lie. After talking to James, Sarah had spent a sleepless night looking through medical textbooks. Nerve compression in the cervical spine, that was practically a death sentence for a fighter under certain circumstances. Ryan's first fight lasted less than 2 minutes. His opponent, a young and inexperienced fighter from Texas, didn't even understand what had happened. A lightning-fast series of punches, a takedown, a chokehold, and it was all over. The crowd erupted in applause. No one, except Sarah, noticed how Ryan, already outside the ring, leaned against the wall for a second, fighting off dizziness. Later that day, James sat in his office watching the recordings of the fights. Images of the day's matches flashed across his laptop screen. He stopped the video at the moment when Ryan performed a takedown, noting a barely noticeable lack of coordination. "Excellent," he muttered, making a note in his notepad. The phone on the desk vibrated. A message from the Swiss clinic confirmed the receipt of the first payment for Ryan's mother's treatment. James smirked. Nobody knew he'd anonymously paid for the course of treatment. His mother raised a worthy warrior. She'll get what her son risked his health for, but other wrongdoings will be punished to the fullest, he thought, recalling the photos of his wife with the other man. And at that time, in a small cafe on the edge of the city, Sarah and Ryan sat at a distant table. Their hands were touching on the table, and that simple touch felt both right and absolutely forbidden. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah whispered. "Every time you get into the ring, I think about my brother. How he died in the ring." "I'm not your brother," Ryan cut her off sharply. That fanatic gleam that was increasingly scaring her appeared in his eyes. "And I won't lose. I can't lose. You saw my fights. I'm getting stronger." "No," Sarah thought. "You're becoming obsessed, just like him." Memories of her brother came flooding back. His last months, his obsession with returning to sports after his injury, his fateful decision. The next few days turned into a kaleidoscope of fights. Ryan was moving up the tournament ladder, leaving a trail of defeated opponents behind him. Each victory was becoming more difficult. Each movement required more effort. But no one, except Sarah, seemed to notice how he would stay in the locker room for longer periods after his fights, trying to get back to normal. James, meanwhile, was spending his evenings in his small gym, set up in the basement of his house. He'd been training Danny here, a 15-year-old kid from a bad neighborhood whom he'd taken under his wing a few months ago. "Boss, is it true that the Marines teach special super-secret moves?" Danny asked one day, working on a punching bag. James looked at the kid, in whom he saw more and more of his younger self. The same thirst for knowledge, the same persistence, the same hidden pain in his eyes. "The main thing the Marines teach, kid," he said, "is to always remain human. Don't do stupid stuff. Think with your head, not just your fists." In the quarterfinal fight, the thing Sarah had feared most happened. After a particularly hard hit, Ryan lost his orientation for a second. He won that fight, but the price of victory was getting higher. "This madness has to stop," she said to him after the fight, while she was treating the cut above his eyebrow. "You see what's happening." Ryan took her hand and pressed it to his cheek. That gesture, so intimate and vulnerable, broke her heart. "I'm almost there," he whispered. "2 fights. Just 2 fights and I can fix everything. Mom will get the treatment, I'll open my own gym. We can be together." Sarah recoiled as if from a blow. There was something feverish in his words, in his plans, something that scared her more and more. She suddenly realized with terrifying clarity that she hadn't fallen in love with a real person, but with an image that she'd created herself, the image of someone she could save. But she could not, it seemed. That same evening, James was sitting in his home office when there was a knock on the door. Sarah was standing on the threshold, the first time in weeks that she had come home before midnight. "You knew," she said without preamble. "You knew about his injury, and you still organized this tournament. You planned it all." James looked at his wife in silence. Fear was swimming in her eyes. Not for herself, but for someone else. She'd once looked at him that way, when he left for another mission. "And you knew you were betraying me." His voice was calm, almost soft. "And you still kept doing it. So who of us is doing something more despicable?" The semi-final fights of the Warriors Legacy Tournament started on a gloomy Saturday evening. The air in the arena was charged with anticipation. The audience felt that something special was going to happen that day. James stood at the edge of the ring. His face, illuminated by the harsh spotlight, looked like it was carved from stone. He watched as Ryan climbed the steps, noting every movement. The barely noticeable stiffness in his shoulders, the slightly slower turns of his head, the sweat on his forehead before the start of the fight. In the locker room before the fight, Ryan pulled out his phone and reread the message from the Swiss clinic for the 100th time. "We are pleased to inform you that an anonymous benefactor has paid the full course of treatment for Mrs. Kelly. Whoever it was, that money gave his mother a chance. But now it wasn't just about her anymore." The semifinal fight was brutal. Ryan's opponent, a seasoned fighter from Nevada, knew about his injury. It was already being whispered about in the locker rooms. Each strike was aimed at his neck and upper back. By the end of the second round, Ryan could barely turn his head. Sarah watched the fight from the first row, her fingers white from tension. She saw what others didn't notice: the microscopic pauses before each movement, the convulsive breaths, the moments of lost coordination. Just like with Mike back then, flashed through her mind, and the memory of her brother washed over her in a new wave of panic. After the fight, which Ryan still won, Sarah found James in his office. He was sitting at his desk, watching recordings of the match on a large monitor. "We need to talk." Her voice was hoarse from contained emotions. James silently pressed pause. On the screen, the face of Ryan froze at the moment of a particularly hard blow. A mask of pain and obsession at the same time. "About what?" "About how you fell in love with the man you were supposed to be treating. Or about how you betrayed not only me but also your professional principles." Sarah sank into a chair, feeling her legs give way. "James, I know I'm to blame, but what you're doing, it's murder." "No." He stood up and went to the window. "Murder is what he's doing to himself. And what you're letting him do." There was no anger in his voice, only fatigue and something else. Maybe disappointment or maybe regret. He turned to her, and Sarah suddenly saw in his eyes the pain that he'd always been so careful to hide. "You know what's the funny thing?" he continued quietly. "I actually loved you, even when I couldn't give you children. Even when I saw you slowly drifting away. Even when I noticed the first signs of your infidelity." Sarah felt tears rise in her throat. For the first time in years, James was talking about his feelings, and it broke her heart. That same evening, Ryan learned the truth about his injury. The doctor, an old friend of his father's, showed him the scans and the analysis. "One more serious blow, and you could end up paralyzed," the doctor said. "Forever. You'll be riding around in a wheelchair and eating with a spoon. Think about it. You don't have anyone to look after you except your sick mother." Ryan looked at the scans, but he saw something else. His father's face before his last fight, his mother's smile in the hospital room, Sarah's eyes, full of anxiety and love. "I can't stop," he whispered. "Not now." Returning home, he stood for a long time in front of the bathroom mirror, looking at the bruises and cuts on his body. In the reflection, he no longer saw a rising MMA star but a man walking on the edge of a cliff. Somewhere deep down, he understood that his obsession with victory had turned into something dark and dangerous, but he couldn't stop anymore. Sarah saw these changes in him. In their last meetings, she caught herself thinking that she didn't recognize the man she'd fallen in love with. His eyes had a feverish glow. His speech was becoming more and more erratic, and his plans for the future were becoming increasingly manic. "After the victory, we'll leave," he'd say, pacing nervously in her office. "I'll open my own gym, train kids. I'll prove to everyone that I'm the best." "Who do you want to prove that to?" she wanted to ask but didn't. She remembered too well the same intonations in her brother's voice before his last fatal decision. The day of the pre-final press conference was uncommonly humid. Journalists from all over the country had gathered in the Alpha Legion conference room. James sat at the center of the dais with Ryan to his right, pale but determined. Sarah watched them from the back rows, feeling the air vibrate with tension. "Mr. Caulfield," a young reporter stood up. "Is it true that you personally set up the tournament bracket?" "Yes." James allowed himself a slight smile. "I wanted each fighter to get a chance to show their true character." Ryan flinched as if from a blow. He'd heard an additional meaning in James's words. Their eyes met, and for a moment, a spark of understanding seemed to pass between them. Both knew that tomorrow's fight between them wouldn't just be for a title or money. It would be a fight for something more. The day of the final fight began long before dawn. James was sitting in his home office, rereading the last entry in his journal. "Today everything will end. Not the way everyone would like, but the way it has to." The first rays of the sun painted the sky the color of old blood, and it seemed to him like an ominous sign. He took out a worn photo of his unit from a safe, the last photo before that fateful ambush in Afghanistan. Young, smiling faces. None of them had lived to see the sunset that day. On the other side of the city, Ryan was spending the morning in a small chapel where he came before every important fight. His knee was hurting badly after the semifinal, and his neck, he tried not to think about his neck. His father's gloves lay before him, worn, soaked with the sweat and blood of 2 generations of fighters. "I'm gonna do this today, Dad," he whispered, stroking the cracked leather. "I'll become the man you wanted me to be." He was interrupted by a phone call, his mother from the Swiss clinic. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Doctors say the treatment is working better than they expected." "Ryan, honey, you shouldn't risk your health." "I have to, Mom." He cut her off. "It's not about the money anymore. It's about something bigger." Sarah spent the night going through her brother's old things. The box with his sports awards, which she hadn't opened for years, was now in front of her. Mike was looking back from the photos, young, handsome, obsessed, just like Ryan. She found his last note. "I'm sorry, sis. I can't live as a cripple. I'm gone." History was repeating itself with terrifying accuracy. By noon, Alpha Legion resembled a disturbed beehive. Television crews were setting up cameras. Bookmakers were taking their last bets. Medics were checking equipment. James methodically walked around the arena, checking every detail. In the locker room, he found Danny, his young student, trying to repeat a fighting stance in front of a mirror. "Boss," the kid turned to him, his eyes burning with admiration. "You're gonna win today, right?" James put a hand on his shoulder. "You know, kid, sometimes winning isn't about destroying your opponent. Sometimes it's about saving him from himself." An hour before the fight, Sarah literally burst into Ryan's locker room. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. "The latest scans." She threw a medical report onto the bench. "You can't fight. It's suicide." Ryan didn't even look at the papers. "You don't understand. This is my only chance to prove." "What? To whom?" Her voice broke. "Your dead father? Your mother who's begging you to stop? The money for her treatment is not needed anymore. Or yourself." He looked up at her, and Sarah recoiled. She hadn't seen a look like that since the day her brother died. The look of a person who'd already crossed some inner line. "I loved you," she whispered. "But now I understand that I loved a ghost. An image that I created myself." When the gong sounded, announcing the start of the fight, the crowd roared. James and Ryan met in the center of the ring. Two fighters, two destinies, two paths that had crossed in the most unexpected way. The first round passed in a tactical struggle. James intentionally kept his distance, studying his opponent's movements. His military training demanded careful reconnaissance before a decisive attack. He saw how Ryan was trying to protect his right side, how he winced at sharp turns of his head. Between rounds, Sarah paced at the edge of the ring, not knowing what to do. She saw how her husband was methodically and calculatingly driving Ryan into a trap. She saw how her lover's movements were becoming more and more constrained with each passing minute. History was repeating itself, but now she was just a spectator. The second round began with a fierce attack by Ryan. He seemed to feel that his strength was leaving him and decided to put everything into one desperate lunge. James calmly took the onslaught, allowing his opponent to tire himself out. His years of service had taught him one important thing: patience. In the break before the third round, Ryan sat in his corner, breathing heavily. Everything was swimming before his eyes, his neck was burning. He looked at the stands and saw ghosts. His father, who had died in the same way in the ring. Sarah's brother, who had chosen death instead of life as a cripple. All those fighters who had broken, unable to withstand the pressure. The third round was decisive. After a particularly hard blow, Ryan lost his orientation for a moment. James saw the perfect moment for a finishing move, the one that could end not only the fight, but the life of the young fighter. And no one would dare to accuse him. It was professional sports. Anything could happen here. Time seemed to stop. James saw his whole life flash before his eyes. The dusty roads of Afghanistan, the faces of his fallen comrades, his years with Sarah, the silent evenings in the empty house where no child's laughter would ever sound. He saw the same fanatic gleam in Ryan's eyes that he had once seen in the eyes of the father's last opponent. The same fire that had burned in Sarah's brother's eyes before his final step. In a split second, he made a decision. Instead of a deadly blow, James unexpectedly kicked his opponent's knee. A crack rang out over the ring, like a dry branch snapping in half. Ryan collapsed onto the mat, his face contorted with pain. The referee stopped the fight. Medics were already rushing to the ring. Sarah rushed toward the stretcher, but Ryan stopped her with a weak gesture. "Don't," he whispered. "I get it now. Your husband. He could have killed me, but he decided to save me today. From myself." There was no longer any obsession in his eyes. Defeat, as it often happens, turned out to be more important than any victory. James watched this scene from his corner of the ring. He didn't feel the triumph of a winner, but a strange peace of a man who'd made the right choice. Doctors were already examining Ryan's knee. The injury would end his career in professional sports, but it would save his life. Later that day, in the empty Alpha Legion gym, James found a note from Sarah. "You turned out to be a better man than I thought. Forgive me. I know that I can't redeem myself from shame. You won't take me back. I'm leaving for Europe. It will be better for everyone." He crumpled the note and went to the window. The city below was lighting up with evening lights. Somewhere out there, in a Swiss clinic, Ryan's mother was receiving treatment, paid for by an anonymous benefactor. Somewhere out there, Ryan was beginning to realize that losing sometimes was more important than winning. And here, in the empty hall, stood a man who hadn't become a murderer today. A year later, James was standing at the window of his office at Alpha Legion, watching the training session in the gym. Danny, now a trainer's assistant, was showing new recruits the basic stances. A new photo hung on the wall, James in the ring at the moment of his last victory. Next to it was an old photo of his unit from Afghanistan. The past and the present merged into one. The morning mail brought a postcard from Zurich. Sarah was working there with the Olympic team, finally finding peace in what she did best, helping athletes overcome their fears. "You were right," she wrote. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself." On the other side of the city, in a small sports center for orphans, Ryan Kelly was finishing another training session. His limp was noticeable, but there was no longer that obsession in his eyes. He had learned to find victories in the little things. In the smile of a child who had performed a move correctly for the first time. In the proud gaze of a mother who had returned to life after successful treatment. In the letters of gratitude from grateful parents. Later that day, James ran his hand over the spine of his old journal. There was only one blank page left in it. "Sometimes," he wrote, "victory is not about breaking your opponent. Victory is about saving the human in yourself."